So for about a decade now, the great and grand leading liberal intellectuals have presented the ongoing drama as fairly straightforward. Populists are bad. Eastern European populists are especially bad, and they're grossly authoritarian to boot. Latin American authoritarians are emboldened fascists, and they too are bad, somewhere between politically unacceptable, aesthetically grotesque, and morally evil. And like the others that I just mentioned, they too prey on people's emotions. Now, populism is an insufficiently helpful term. There's a number of debates around that. And in some ways, so is fascism. And there's a number of debates around that. And in some ways, both are useful. What is more interesting in an opening salvo is how these concepts have served this us versus them narrative that has predominated since the early 2010s. Against these bland, simplistic descriptions of enemies bad has stood the defense of liberalism. Liberalism, good, is we learn the basis of all intelligent politics. It's a convenient and overcooked binary that we get to learn. There, we the rational, whereas the emotions belong to the extremes and are easily manipulated, usually by Russia. Or China or other bad powers. We, the rational, think of pluralities, we articulate plans and policies, we care, but against this sort of good force of history, there are manipulators and emotions and also bad identitarians. In France, the use of the Front Républicain against the National Front and now against the Rassemblement National has bordered on the callous. In the US, the same defenders of liberalism warned us that only a post-Obama machine that bridges the very feminist feminism of Hillary Clinton, the ceiling-breaking centrism of Clinton and Harris, no glass has been broken, the solid functioning of the economy, the loud, if generally meaningless, respect for difference, as it's pronounced, the nostalgia for an era where human rights were taken seriously and where the deaths in Afghanistan and Iraq were lamentable but acceptable prices to pay for liberal security. Only this kind of mixture, we've been told, could supposedly stand against the fury of those that Hillary Clinton memorably called the deplorables. In Italy, enough Berlusconi-esque governments have dominated since the 1990s to leave things confused enough for a party with actual fascist roots to take power. In Europe, noted historians, or as regards Europe, noted historians on the heels of their books like Bloodlands and Black Earth wrote books about on tyranny and the road to unfreedom and on freedom. Sorry, that's just one notable historian. Another no less tweet-adept historian is my esteemed colleague who warns endlessly with page references to their book on Twitter and YouTube and MSNBC and CNN about strongmen and their playbooks. And there are many others, from Anne Applebaum, seemingly the entirety of MSNBC, to a certain Yale philosopher, author of no less pompous titles as How Fascism Works, How Propaganda Works, and Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. This person has ostensibly declared himself the only common sense explainer of an apparently combative center. He's speaking at NYU this evening. Rachel Maddow, I'm not kidding, Rachel Maddow of MSNBC was invited to one of the headline panels of the annual AHA meeting, American Historical Association meeting, thereby closing the circle of mutual legitimation. In all of these cases, this paradigm, this we, are not responsible for any particular ills. I tried to avoid names in this introduction, hard as it was with Applebaum, because I couldn't figure out what to call to use it. But the titles and the overall pretense are what matters, I think, to me. Now, people get public attention. There's nothing very surprising about that. And fragments of what I've said may well be accurate. I certainly wouldn't hold back from the argument that what is going on is aesthetically grotesque and morally disturbing. And I, for one, am convinced that what is politically arising is a version of fascism. The term needs to be updated, reloaded, defined in a more interesting way rather than one in which we're talking simply about analogy. But the totality of the above argument amounts to a moral fantasy of the world, coupled with a demand that we all accede to liberal theory of political subjectivity. If we are to oppose this disgrace, that we announce and denounce the pliability of others, and that we speak of our strength as individuals and as a movement in defense of a specific vision of democracy, as if we were not allowed to oppose the disgrace otherwise. This, I think, has been a pernicious argument that provides succor and comfort and dignity to those whom I would usually refer to as Biden's useful idiots, an echo of Tony Judd's article against the liberal advocates for the Iraq War. Not only does the liberal angle warp the general discussion by granting money and ideas to this particular space, but it reproduces the pretense that this is a middle ground politics opposed only by a supposed far left, rather than any kind of plenitude of scholarship or reading or interpretation or intellectual work. When anyone demanded that we analyze post-truth, these were the same intellectuals who somehow denounced post-structuralism, postmodernism, and all these other apparent evils as the relativism that is destroying America and enabling Trump. When anyone pointed out that the war in Russia was a deeply problematic proxy war that had tired out allies and seemed likely to fail anyway, just on the basis of resource differentials, these people demanded scalps. And now, as even Peter Beiner finally acknowledged in the New York Times yesterday, this has been such an influential ideology that has tried to silence any disapproval of the destruction of Gaza and Lebanon, because, to quote Kamala Harris, if you want Donald Trump to win, then say that. How well did that work? Now, this is a liberalism that is lived by rendering some forms of violence unmentionable, on top of all the other things. So at least the demands of the simplistic narrative no longer hold. The self-celebrating, we the rational, they the emotional, the manipulated, has been devastating to any serious understanding of the far right, because whatever discussion there was, there would always be this louder boombox on the side. And has been similarly derelict as a way for us to understand how we engage with our political positions, what our agency is, what our responsiveness can be, who it is that we are addressing. The far right, including openly fascistic parties, is somewhere between on the rise and well-established across Europe, from the AfD in Germany to Britain's conservatives, lurching ever more convulsively past Enoch Powell and Nigel Farage. The same is also the case, too, from Netanyahu's Likud to Modi's party in India, to the US president-elect, to the Philippines, to parts of Latin America. And to be clear, while we've been fed some of these narratives, each of us has also believed them, if only a little, if only to believe that through them, something would work out okay. And we could make compromises left and right for the argument to work because the alternative was worse. So that's where we are for now, as far as I see it. Welcome to the Remarque Institute on political emotions on the far right. We played a lot with that on the far right. Would we call it in the far right, at the far right? You know, like what's the geographic that we do this? I'm the Remarque's director, Stefanos Geroulanos. Apparently I have to read even that from this. And this is an event we first discussed and organized back when Joe Biden had just become the nominee. What was important was, regardless of the results of the election, to take advantage of this ambiguity to devise a smarter way of thinking about the voters of the right. What a few months ago, and again, once Harris became the nominee and there was a measure of excitement, what seemed an interesting exercise to invite people whose thought and scholarship I've admired and who haven't necessarily had the centrality in these discussions that I wanted them to have, now seems an urgent imperative. So so this is where I'm, let's say, beginning. Thank you so much to Sam Paul, Remarque's assistant director, and Amy Nguyen, Remarque's administrative aide and DJ, and Lauren Lee, whom I haven't seen Lauren.
She'll be here.
Downstairs, maybe. Our student assistant who will have greeted you downstairs by the end of the day. All three have been indefatigable, even more so than usual this semester, and leading to this event. And in a week like this, all the more so. I want to thank a private foundation as well, and also Provost Gigi Topico, whose office supported this event, but who cannot, after all, be here because of a funeral that she has to attend. It's important to me that we have her support in working to rethink the alibis that we have been giving ourselves. Alibis. Because after a decade, because after a decade, from my perspective, we've heard quite enough about manipulated voters, manipulated emotions, Steele dossiers, Trumpian malpractice, about how good liberals cannot recoil because they have to capture a center and convince enough good people, women especially, particularly against the money that's coming from the right, and thanks to the Supreme Court, and that has been distorting the playing field. This rhetoric about manipulations that others carry out, about paranoia and the paranoid style of others, about the fundamental irrationality of right-wing desire grew again, perhaps without the Steele dossier, but definitely with new arguments about Russia. And alongside it has arisen a second language about the traumatic effects of the right's success, about suffering, displacement, fear. This too deserves emotion, attention. The political stances of the center and the left and the role of academics in them are not exactly what I care about in the time that remains to me for this intro. What remains or matters to me is the knowledge problem, the image of subjectivity. Engagements like we, the rational, they, the emotional, leave aside everything and everything interesting that we have learned over almost a century of analytical work on the far right. Much and much more serious work has been done by other intellectuals like Sam Adler-Bell in the podcast Neuroenemy. Sam, are you here? Nice to meet you, Sam. And for partly different audiences, for example, Natalie Wen on ContraPoints and decoding and rethinking the stances of the right. Adler-Bell will do a longer-term tracking of young intellectuals on the right in his presentation later. Additionally, how do we think more intelligently about the fury that is so patent on the extreme right, and that nevertheless demands that we not fall back on the liberal approach? Carlo Invernizzi Accetti will start the first panel on that subject, a political theory of rage since Achilles. I need to cite the different speaker, partly because I've asked the chairs not to introduce everybody. There are printouts of the bios and program outside. Dagmar Herzog, citing Wilhelm Reich as to why human beings submit to political arrangements, notes that for Reich, it is not the content of ideas, nor even a vague emotional content, but literally the corporeal image, the corporeal impact of ideology, especially an ideology that enforced sexual fear and self-restriction. But that was for what Reich saw necessary for these submissions. Herzog, and I'm delighted that you're here, Dagmar, to discuss your research on the AfD in relation to their eugenic fantasies and appalling treatment of the disabled. Herzog argues instead for the enabling and sexually enabling function of fascism, as does another of my favorite authors on the subject, Klaus Teweleit, who in Männerfantasien, Male Fantasies, a study of the Freikorps soldiers' memoirs and novels, explains the leader's speech as having at once a healing quality and the quality of arousal. It's all about ending, he writes, a certain kind of psychic castration. Quote, the monstrous form that is oratory emerges from the mouth of the Führer and closes around there, the listeners, open wounds. The ritual of the speech protects them from castration and makes clear that men, meaning men who are suffering, who perceive themselves as suffering, must join together with men, phallus with phallus, at the expense of whatever is socially below them. When the leader speaks and the audience moves into formation, when both speaker and audience have assumed the correct form and can anticipate mutual contact, which must not be expressed as actual male love, since this is strictly forbidden, then the man, even as officer, is permitted to cry. Indeed, he is called upon to cry at this point. Teweleit concludes, the orgasm of oratory, surpassed only by the orgasm of killing, end quote. Now, this figure of the extreme right speaker and listener, at once healed through speech and sexually aroused into community, could this figure be any further from the scenario that we are usually presented with? And yet, it seems to me a really forceful figure. Thank you, by the way, Madison, for reminding me of that passage. It seems to me a really forceful figure, a way of understanding not so much identitarianism as the deep anxiety fueled by economics as much as libido, for those who feel profoundly left out and pressured into what Teweleit sees as a political and physical castration, and who are quite ready to impose that same violence onto. I'll note that a different but no less forceful dynamic comes in Shayward Darby's analysis in her book, Sisters in Hate. Shayward, are you here? Not yet? Okay. Who will present later about her book, Sisters in Hate, one of the early and key works to consider women on the far right, and to complicate the picture of their place in that book. No less important to me are two or three more references that I'd like to continue with as a way of setting the stage. One belongs to the space discussed by Alberto Toscano, welcome Alberto, in his recent book, Late Fascism, which asks us to return to 1970s theories of fascism, to think with intentional asynchrony about the current moment. One quoted by Toscano is from Adorno, and perhaps prefaces Toscano's and Zahid Chaudhry's presentations today on the conception of freedom. Here's Toscano first, and then quoting Adorno. Toscano, at the psychoanalytic level, fascism preys on the contradiction between the self-preserving conatus of the ego and its constantly frustrated drives. Adorno, from Freudian theory and the pattern of fascist propaganda, this is a conflict that results in strong narcissistic impulses which can be absorbed and satisfied only through idealization as a partial transfer of the narcissistic libido to the object, that is the leader. By making the leader his ideal, the person loves himself, as it were, but gets rid of the stains of frustration and discontent, which mar his picture of his own empirical self. The last of my prefatory quotes comes from Félix Guattari, the psychiatrist, who's compelling to me as a thinker of the psyche-society relationship when he writes, "Everybody wants to be a fascist." That's the title of the essay, where here follows the passage. He writes that when revolt ceased to be led and controlled by communism, when it became quite uncontrollable, quote, the capitalist system was forced to search internally for new formulas of totalitarianism. New forms of molecular fascism are developing, a slow-burning fascism and familialism in school and racism in every kind of ghetto. Everywhere the totalitarian machine is in search of proper structures, which is to say structures capable of adapting desire to the profit economy. A little later, Guattari continues, fascism has already made it and continues to make it. It passes through the tightest mesh. It is in constant evolution to the extent that it shares in a micropolitical economy of desire, itself inseparable from the evolution of the productive forces. Fascism seems to come from the outside, but it finds its energy right at the heart of everyone's desire. We must stop once and for all being misled by the sinister buffooneries, his words not mine, of those social democrats who are so astonished that their army, allegedly the most democratic in the world, launches without notice the worst of fascist repressions. Fascism, he continues, like desire, scattered everywhere in separate bits and pieces within the whole social realm. It crystallizes in one place or another, depending on the relationships of force. Now, this is very 70s. And when I read it last night, I was thinking of the newly heterogeneous social and economic groupings that became the bastion of Trump's new coalition, and they're excited about their own power, misdirect Guattari's passage a bit, their own proliferation and exasperation of repressive responses. What's worse, perhaps Guattari speaks to the troubles with normativity that we see today, and especially the mutual recriminations about normativity that are so characteristic now. That for many of the, on the far right, norms are set by urban educated elites, norms that feel like they distort their familiar, their common sense family, while we react that the majoritarian conservatism is, of course, what has blocked any sense of difference, inclusiveness, transformation, progress. I'm particularly interested in both Darby's and Adler-Bell's talks, in part for how they handle the problem of separated value systems that use often the same words, but not the same concept, especially in the present, fragmented, even in some respects Schmittian, for lack of a better abbreviation, media landscape. And thus it is no longer we the rational and they the emotional scenario, but we the emotional and they the emotional, both of us in different rationalities, partly determined by a transformation of economic conditions in the state. At least two presentations today will concern the economy and the economically driven world. Fabian Muniesa will speak on finance and paranoia, and thank you, Fabian, for making time during an already very hectic trip to come and speak to us. And Shahrzad Shams is the only speaker who has explicitly emphasized in their title and blurb the transformation and fragmentations of neoliberal capitalism and the ways in which these have been used by the far right. Many of these are structural issues. Many of the issues at hand are structural issues. A former superpower declining internationally, at least since George W. Bush, other powers that are developing larger middle classes that aren't interesting in the economy that the US offers them, the costs of 90s and 2000s globalization that have transfigured into ghosts and precarity and so-called bullshit jobs, the costs of wars past and present, constantly belying the pretense to moral superiority, the global far-right movement that appeals not only to elites, but to people who can feel constantly the decline of their comparative advantage. In the French context, a similar sociological and phenomenological description of a world in decline and angry about that decline comes from the writer Edouard Louis, who will be here with us in April, in his text, his well-known text, Why My Father Votes for the Front National, where Louis discounted his father's homophobia and racism in favor of a different and similarly structural explanation. This too belongs to the environment I'm trying to describe, meaning to the environment I'd like us to be beginning with. These elections, he writes, quote, were a way for him to combat his invisibility. My father had understood long before me that in the minds of the bourgeoisie, our existence did not count. We were not real. My father had felt abandoned by the left since the 1980s. So now I think that I've described quite enough. We've talked quite long enough. My aim had been to destabilize both the main narrative and the standpoint from which we would speak comfortably. It is up to our speakers from here on to direct our thinking and our discussion. So without further ado, Daniel Steinmetz-Jenkins is going to get us started on the first panel.
Great. Many thanks, Stefanos, for that excellent introduction. As he mentioned, I'm not going to give a long introduction to the speakers. If you look at the back of your handout, there's detailed biographical information. But what I will do is just mention their names and the titles of their papers as they in order of their domain. So the first speaker is my colleague at City College, director of the Moynihan Center, Carlo Invernizzi. Accetti. It's a new book that just came out in Italian. I think we're going to get an English version of that book today. It's titled 20 Years of Rage from the No Global to the No Vax.
Oh, so I'll start. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Stefanos, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. As Danny mentioned, what I'll be presenting today is a book that came out in May in Italian, with that title. And I'm now in the process of translating and adapting to the US context. The title will change a little bit because it's going to be 25 years of rage from the no global to Trumpism, as opposed to the no vax, which I guess is a sign of the times. And the book is essentially an attempt to give a name or identify something that would maybe a zeitgeist or a spirit of the times in these turbulent times that we have lived since more or less the beginning of the century. And we've all lived through that time, so I don't need to go in detail of recounting all the events that had happened, but to identify a little bit the object of the analysis, I think it's helpful to start from a list of some of the things that have happened more or less since the year 2000, and maybe a little before. Just before preparing this talk, I looked again at how it was before then, and I looked at the inaugural speech of Bill Clinton in 1992, which now looks so much like a different time. You know, Clinton, if you look at it on YouTube, it's, yep, we won, it's over, and now it's just going to be capitalism and democracy, we just have to extend it. It was an optimistic, the time of the so-called end of history, just a completely different mood. And it's the difference in mood from that time that I'm trying to capture in this book. And just to recount a few of the things that have happened since this change, I guess the mood began to change at the beginning of the 2000s with this, that's where the book starts, with the anti-globalization movement of the early 2000s. I'm just going to list a few of these events. Then soon after, of course, September 11th, that sparked the war on terror. Then, if you're European, the no to the proposed referendum on the European Constitutional Treaty was a big shock in 2005, immediately after followed by the banlieue riots around Paris, again in 2005. Then, of course, the crisis of 2008, which sparked a number of movements across the world, the Indignados movement in Spain, Occupy Wall Street, the OHI, another big no, the no to the proposed memorandum of Greece. And then it just keeps getting faster and faster. We get to the annus horribilis of 2016 with Brexit, Trump, and immediately after that, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, the Gilets jaunes. It keeps accelerating the speeches of Greta Thunberg, Fridays for Future, coming up to the present day. And, you know, the protests in the universities, the days of rage that were declared last spring, and of course, the return of Trumpism, yes, or the day before yesterday, or something like that. All of these events, of course, have their own specificities and belong to particular histories. But if you're in the business of trying to understand something that could be called like a spirit of the times, is there a common thread? A thread that unites all of these events that have characterized, I guess, our time? The argument I try to make in the book is that if there is a common thread in our time, is it's not at the level of actors. The actors that did all these things were very different. And it's not even at the level of the goals. The goals of all these movements were wildly different from each other, but it's at the level of a mood or an emotion that underpins them all, and that may therefore help us make sense of our times. And the argument is that this mood, if we want to give it a name, could be something like anger or rage with respect to political institutions. And I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the difference between anger, rage, and all these synonyms, because I'm trying to understand a phenomenon. And therefore, there's a lot of philosophy of the differences between those. We can get into it, but I'm trying to understand the phenomenon, not a definition. So I'll maybe using those terms interchangeably. And what I want to do to try to persuade you of the fact that we live in raging times, the Raging 20 could be another title, is the presentation follows a little bit the structure of the book. I'll basically begin by talking a little bit about what is rage, what is anger, and why I think it applies to understand our present time. Then I'll talk a little bit about why I think so many different people with different goals have been so angry. And then I conclude with a section on how the political establishments have responded to this rage, and why I think actually the responses have contributed in further exacerbating it rather than mitigating it. All right, so what is rage? Here is where I turn, as Stefanos mentioned, to the archive of what I know best, which is the history of political thought. And the first thing that you discover if you read the philosophy of rage or anger is that anger has not a good reputation in the history of Western political thought. If you take Seneca de Ira, he defines anger as a brevis insania, which is a temporary madness. And so it's something pathological and irrational, which is, of course, part of the broader Stoic, but I would argue rationalist, to connect back to what Stefanos was saying, condemnation of all emotions. So the operative thing is reason is good, and anger, which is a paradigm of all emotions, is bad. But that's not only the rationalist Stoic tradition that has this condemnation. If you take Christianity, it's clear that anger is one of the cardinal sin, the cardinal sins, and the invitation is to turn the other cheek. And then again, in early bourgeois morality, the passions that were opposed to the interests, it's clear that anger is something bad. If you take Montesquieu, for instance, anger is associated with war, whereas interest and rationality is associated with le doux commerce and the capacity to actually repress one's emotion in order to pursue one's own interests. And that carries on through the whole contemporary therapeutic approach to anger. You may know that it is possible for employers or even judiciary authority to prescribe anger management courses to people today. So the pattern is clear. Anger is seen as pathological, it's seen as irrational, it's seen as bad, to take the term that Stefanos was using. And my premise is that it's not very useful to start trying to think about our time from such a normatively loaded perspective, in part because if you prejudge your rubric from the start, it's a problem, but more importantly because the irrational cannot by definition be understood. And if we want to actually understand it, we have to develop other categories for it. And also, in fact, I think it's counterproductive, because if it's something that makes people angry more when they're angry, so tell them calm down, be rational. So it's actually the whole framework just undercuts itself. Which is why what I try to do in the book is turn to an earlier tradition that has attempted to develop a different paradigm of what anger is. Prior to the Stoic revolution or introduction of new concepts, in classical ancient Greece, I think there's a different paradigm of anger, where anger is not seen as something pathological, but as something natural and therefore in a sense healthy and maybe even noble. You might know that the first word of the Iliad, which is to say the first word of Western literature, is anger or meaning. The anger of Achilles that drives the whole, that's what the thing is about, right? It's the two big accessions of rage of Achilles. And Achilles is not a pathological figure. In fact, he's a hero. And it is part of what to be a hero is, to be driven by this powerful emotion. So it's of course terrifying, Achilles' rage, but it's not pathological in that sense. In fact, Aristotle, when he discusses this text in the Rhetoric, he makes an interesting point about rage not being pathological. He says, the incapacity to feel rage is the mark of a slave. If you're not able in the face of injustice to get angry, then actually you are a slave. And so even a democratic citizen needs to have the capacity for feeling rage, according to Aristotle. And that's why I want to start from that paradigm to try to understand a bit what rage is, and to try to understand in that sense the present through the ancients. And so let's think about that. Why is Achilles angry at the beginning of the Iliad? What is that meaning, that rage that drives him? If you remember the story, Achilles is angry because Agamemnon, the king of the Greeks, has taken his slave Briseis, which he has won in battle. And therefore he refuses to fight in the war against the Trojans. What's significant for me here is that actually this theft doesn't really make Achilles poorer. Agamemnon tells him quite explicitly, you can have any other slave. So I don't think it's an economic driver that is driving Achilles. Achilles says, actually, I have been treated like any foreigner. I have been treated like any foreigner. And what that refers to is the fact that I think it's a question not of socioeconomic wealth, but of status. His status as a great hero has been offended. And that's exactly what Aristotle says in his reading of that text too. It's an offense to his dignity, to his honor, to his status, to be treated like any foreigner and not as like the hero that he actually is. So the idea here is that what is driving anger, the emotion that drives anger, and that's my last Greek reference. If you take, because we've been talking about psychoanalysis, I was not planning to talk about this, but if you take Plato's analysis of the human soul, it famously has three parts. There is eros and logos, which is eros is desire and logos is reason. And all of the Western frameworks for understanding psychologies are usually based on the alternation between eros and logos, reason and desire. That applies to modern economic theory, infinite desires, but practical rationality, but it applies to psychoanalysis, superego and ego. What they all forget is the third part of the soul, which is what Plato calls timos. Timos is this desire for recognition, we could translate it, desire for honor, the desire for status, the sense of oneself. And so the emotion that underpins anger, or the driver is, not the emotion, the faculty that underpins anger is this timos, this desire for recognition, which is a third part of the soul, not driven by desire, but this desire for recognition. I think we see that in a lot of the phenomena that we have been described, that I mentioned at the beginning. If you take all the most important slogans of the past 25 years, Make America Great Again, Allah is great, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, but also things like the Gilets jaunes, the wearing of yellow vests. None of these actually point to socioeconomic kinds of demands. They all point to this dimension of dignity, recognition, greatness, status, my life matters. The slogan of the five-star movement in Italy, one of the instances of populism, was everyone is worth one, uno vale uno. And this concept of worth, of dignity, of recognition is really, in my opinion, what is lots of people for different reasons, even though they're actually socioeconomically doing not so bad these days, feel misrecognized for some important reason. And that is what I think is, and that's what I think is driving the anger of the present day, if we read it through the framework of Achilles. Achilles was not made poorer, he was just offended in his dignity by Agamemnon. Okay, so if that's anger, a response to an offense that touches upon our dignity, the question becomes, why are so many people so angry today? And this gives me to the second part of the book, where I try to explain why there is this problem with recognition. And by the way, I should say, I don't want to say that it's not the economy stupid. I want to admit that there are economic questions, but I just want to point attention to this other dimension, the timological dimension, the role of timos in driving what is happening today. And there, the intuition that I draw is that if what is at the heart of the rage of our time is a problem of recognition, the intuition of the explanation that I have in the book comes from another philosophical archive, I guess revolving around the figure of Hegel and Kojève, is the idea that recognition is not something that can be given to you. It's something that can only be obtained in the first person through a struggle, the famous struggle for recognition. So the intuition that I pursue in the book is that at the origin of the lack of recognition, there is a crisis in the dimension of struggle. So the chapter is actually entitled, with an inversion of Wellsbeck's book, The Contraction of the Domain of the Struggle. Why? Because struggle, I think, has two core components. Some idea of active participation and some idea of organized conflict. And it seems to me that one of the features of our time is that both those dimensions, active participation and organized struggle, have been declining. There's a lot of social scientific data that we can take. I refer to the book of Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, to talk about how the domain of active participation, the crisis of civic associationism, of political partisanship that has existed since the 80s, is a part of it. But more deeply, the idea that the organized struggle, the lines of fight, are increasingly blurred. And what you get is an increasingly individualized, atomized, Twitterized society where everybody's fighting against everybody else, rather than in terms of organized lines of struggle. If that is true, if we're living in a society where we bowl alone and are fighting everybody else at the same time, struggle, understood in a Hegelian sense as organized struggle with others, declines. And that is the underlying explanation of why so many people feel misrecognized today. I guess one way of doing this, and by the way, I should emphasize, this is a trade book. It's not an academic book, so there's a little more freedom in the kinds of references one can draw from. So I tried to express this point, as well as through Houellebecq's book, which is famously about an incel, through the film Taxi Driver. I don't know if you remember the film Taxi Driver, but what happens there is this person comes back from Vietnam and finds a society which is completely pulverized, where all the struggles that existed, he wants to get involved in politics, appear empty, appear vacuous, and he is alone behind his screen, driving the taxi alone at night. That's why he becomes increasingly angry against society and takes his revenge against it. In this brutal and way, which is how the film ends. So we are all Travis Bickle. We are all individualized, atomized, alienated from struggle in our taxis, and that's why we are angry. That would be the core thesis of what is underpinning them. The crisis in the dimension of struggle, organized struggle, that is at the heart of this. The category I use to understand this new type of subjectivity, I take actually from the philosopher Sloterdijk. He says, there's the emergence of a new world historical figure in our time, which is the figure of the loser, which has often been referred to as like losers of globalization, are the ones who vote for these angry populists. But I want to use the concept of loser in a different way, because in the concept of losers of globalization, it's much more referred to the socioeconomic dimension. Whereas my point is, this is about timos, this is about the symbolic dimension of recognition. So the loser is different, of course, from the slave, which was the figure of unhappy consciousness in antiquity, who is juridically oppressed, but is also different from the proletarian, which is the unhappy consciousness of modernity, because the proletarian is not juridically oppressed, they have formal rights, but they are economically oppressed. Sloterdijk says the loser is neither juridically nor economically oppressed, they are symbolically oppressed. They are declassed. They experience a form of symbolic oppression, which is at the heart of their anger. The loser is the new world historical figure of our present day, in this technical sense. The incel, Travis Bickle. Okay, so I said why I think what I think anger is, why I think we are angry. I conclude by talking a little bit about how the political systems of the West have attempted to respond to this seething and growing rage of our time, and why I think both strategies have actually failed. And it seems to me the dominant political strategies that have been adopted in the present day are, let's say, on one hand, technocracy, and on the other hand, populism. And we live in a time where politics oscillates between the two poles. And I think actually both fail to mitigate anger and end up exacerbating it. Technocracy could be defined as the idea that we can soothe the rage of people through good government. If we just put competent people in charge, they will give the people goodies, and the people will be happy and stop protesting. This, in my opinion, fails to understand the root of the rage, which is precisely not a socioeconomic root. It's not eros that is driving the rage, it's timos. So you can give people as many goods as they want, satisfy their material desires as much as you want, but if you're not addressing that other dimension of timotic recognition, you will not actually address this root of the rage. And I think we see this very well in the failure of Bidenomics. Because, look, Biden, in my opinion, pretty much did everything that in 2016, we, the Social Democrats, were saying that what needed to be done to address the rise of populism with Brexit and Trump. There were the losers of globalization, but globalization as a whole is good. We just have to redistribute a bit of the advantages and everything will be fine. Biden did that. The Inflation Reduction Act, investments in the South. The economy is doing well nowadays. We're living in a country which is basically full employment, where inflation has been high, aggregate inflation over the past 4 years, maybe around 25%, but real wages have grown. So, and especially in the lower quintile. In the lower quintile, wages have grown more than inflation. So I don't think that socioeconomic deprivation is enough to explain this fact. And that's what technocracy misses. Good government gives goodies, but what people want is dignity, and therefore participation in the struggle, and this kind of top-down delivery of goods kind of misses completely that point. And that's my interpretation of the failure of Bidenomics. The other approach, which is populism, and of course Trumpism, in my opinion, understands much better the root of the problem. That at the root of the problem there is, as Beppe Grillo famously said in 2007, uno vale uno, understands this demand for recognition, this demands for worth, that is at the heart of this. So populism understands the problem much better, meets it, but gives a response that, in my opinion, is also counterproductive. And with that, I will end explaining why. Populism understands the roots of the rage as a form of recognition, but in the end ends up transferring this desire for participation, this desire for struggle, entirely to the figure of the charismatic leader that fights on your behalf, and therefore ultimately reproduces the very problem of marginalization, exclusion, and individualization that is at the root of the rage. So populism understands the problem, but gives a solution that actually ends up exacerbating by transferring the desire for participation into the figure of the charismatic leader on your behalf. So my expectation is that we already moved from 20 to 25 years of rage. Until we remain stuck in the binary between technocracy and populism, it may well continue even more. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Carlo. Next presenter is Shahrzad Shams. She's here in town at the Roosevelt Institute. Title of the talk is Appealing to Identity and Emotion, How the Far Right Weaponizes the Socio-Psychological Consequences of the Neoliberal Order. All yours.
Thank you. Let me see if I can get this. 1 second. Yeah, okay, you said that. Thank you. Well, perfect segue. Well, first, thank you for having me. This is awesome to be here. I just want to say at the outset, I'm not even a little bit of an expert in European politics, so I'm going to be focusing on the American landscape, but I think that there are a lot of overlaps, so I'll be excited to hear from folks on where the similarities exist. I wrote a report earlier this year with some colleagues as part of a larger project motivated by the sense that, generally speaking, the left has focused its fire on securing greater rights and income for people, which is, of course, worthy work, but it has really failed to ground itself in a broader vision of what it wants society and individual life to look like. In other words, it's really failed to articulate a clear definition of the good life, which is really necessary for any political order to succeed. And we can really see this all around us today in left spaces, whether you're in politics or policy, or if you're in academia, even in outside social movements. And it manifests, as Carlo was pointing out, in this narrow and technocratic approach that really misunderstands human motivation and how political and ideological power often work. In the economic policy space, which is where I'm coming from, it shows up in this belief that if you can just deliver good economic policies for people, then they'll be compelled to vote for you. It's very logical, very rationalistic, but it's not accurate. And it doesn't seem to be based in a reality of how people actually see the world and relate to policy and politics. It doesn't seem to matter from a political perspective, as you've just pointed out, and as the recent election bears out, how good the Biden administration's economic policies have been for working people, because most people just don't think of life in terms of child tax credits or Inflation Reduction Acts. By contrast and in juxtaposition to the left, though, in recent years, the right's taken quite a different approach. It's focused a lot less on policy as a tool for garnering political support, and instead it has appealed to identity and emotion. And those on the far right, especially, have been really successful in articulating a clear vision of what they want society and individual life to look like. They have a very clear North Star. Of course, it's reprehensible, it's ethno-nationalist, it's heteronormative, it's patriarchal, but it is a very clear vision nonetheless. And as much as we on the left are hateful toward that vision, and we're very right to be, of course, it became clear to my colleagues and I that the political project of the right was resonating with huge numbers of people, while our political project was not. And of course, now that we're in November 2024, none of us here take pleasure in being right about that, of course. But at any rate, we decided to start looking into why this would be the case, why people are being drawn to authoritarian politics, and what it was about fascism today, in the political and cultural context of the US in the 21st century, that was appealing to people, excuse me. So I'm not going to have time to get into the full contents of the report today, of course, so I'm just going to be speaking to some of the aspects of the paper that focus on how the far right leverages emotion and identity for political gain. And I think in order to do that, we need to situate the current political moment in the ideological, economic, and cultural paradigm that has reigned in the US and around the world for last several decades, and that today is under siege from both the left and the right. And that ideological, political, and cultural project is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is, of course, the free market capitalist ideology that really began as a theoretical framework, but over time ossified and transformed into political wisdom and policy. And by the second half of the 20th century, the economic philosophy of early 20th century neoliberal thinkers became simplistic policy prescription. And there's been really a wealth of fantastic work done in recent years on the failures of neoliberalism as a policy project and how it's really hurt the economic security of workers. And these critics have really focused on how neoliberal policies like deregulation, slash taxes, privatization, and austerity have really ravaged the middle class and have created economic and political inequality. And this work has been really critical to getting us to a post-neoliberal world. But these critiques have all too often stayed in the realm of policy, when in reality, neoliberalism is so much more than a policy project. Equally an ideological project that has had devastating cultural effects and has shaped, really warped our psyches. So just briefly, some of the tenets of this ideology, we're probably all familiar, but neoliberal ideologies, it's incredibly hyper-individualistic. The rational, self-interested actor is sort of the fundamental unit of social analysis. It's hyper-competitive. There's an emphasis on freedom of choice and self-reliance. There's this preoccupation with free markets. They're the panacea and really the only solution, the place to look for your solutions for your problems outside of yourself or maybe your nuclear family at most. And it's an ideology that is deeply steeped in meritocracy, in narratives of deservedness, in hard work, social mobility, fairness, and individual effort. And we argue in the paper that all of these features have been extraordinarily harmful to our individual well-being and to our culture and society at large. So how so? There, in many ways, but in the paper, we point to the cultural destruction that's inflicted by these tenets as having 5 main characteristics, each of which produces a longing for its opposite. I'm just going to do a quick summary for actual data points. I'll refer you to the report itself. But first, in a neoliberal society, people feel detached and isolated from others, right? Loneliness, unhappiness, and suicide have all been on the rise, trending upward for the past 30 or so years. I'm sure that we all feel this, but we're all overworked, we're all burnt out, we're all stressed, time poverty is endemic, and this really cuts across class lines too. And then if we look at the societal level, if we zoom out and focus not just on the individual level, we can see social atomization, declining sense of belonging, whether it's among circles of friends, communities, or the nation. And of course, we see trust in institutions declining as well. As a result, unsurprisingly, people yearn for community and belonging. Second, we argue that neoliberalism has manufactured a great deal of precarity. It's helped to create real and invented threats. And in order to maintain its ideological legitimacy, supporters of neoliberalism have created and disseminated a great deal of capitalist propaganda. And all of this has left people feeling insecure, scared, unsure of their prospects. And so naturally, instead, people want to feel safe and secure. Third, neoliberalism has led to inordinate consolidated power, economically and politically speaking. People feel that they don't have a hand in shaping their lives, and so naturally they long for a sense of agency and control and empowerment over their situations and their circumstances. And then with the explosive pace of technological advancement under neoliberal capitalism, we are experiencing incredibly rapid change as a society, whether it's the ubiquity of social media or the anxiety that comes with the breakneck speed of advancing AI. And at the same time, of course, we're witnessing all these institutional failures around us that are very much a result of neoliberalism itself. And so we're living in this landscape of confusion, frustration, and declining trust, which makes us want clear explanations for why the world works as it does, why we feel as bad as we do, and who is responsible for creating the state of chaos that we're living in. And then lastly, all of this, the lack of time, the stress about money, the overwork, loneliness, the shame, the burnout, the working hard but not seeing results, like all of this just makes us feel like shit. And We don't want to feel like shit, right? Like we want to feel good. We want to feel pleasure. We want to feel content. So enter the right, ready to prey on this bleak emotional landscape under neoliberalism's hegemony. Obviously, the right is not a monolith, but it does seem that different strands of the reactionary movement are unified in utilizing the strategy of appealing to emotion and identity in order to manufacture buy-in for their political agenda and to reach that vision of that heteronormative ethno-nationalist patriarchal society. And in order to do that, they first and foremost use cultural channels. And this lies in contrast to the approach that the left takes, right? That technocratic, policy-first approach that really fails to resonate with people. And in the report, we draw on different sects of the right that use this culture-first emotion and identity appeal strategy. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on a subset or a group of the right that invokes this strategy. That is a group that we refer to in the report as, and this is a super unsexy title, we should have thought through this a little bit better, self-help toxic masculinists. You are almost certainly aware of these guys. These are people like Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate, who have amassed enormous online followings, and they use cultural channels like podcasts, YouTube videos, books, and live streaming platforms to disseminate their message. So these guys, they give standard self-help advice, like make your bed, stand up straight with your shoulders back, compare yourself to yesterday's you, not somebody else's today, or like take responsibility for your actions. And what they do is they infuse that advice with reactionary views on a whole host of issues, but gender tends to feature prominently. The target audience for these guys is young men who feel lonely, they feel stuck in a rut, they feel down on themselves. I think the archetype is like a 20-something-year-old guy who's like still living in his parents' basement, and maybe he's unemployed or maybe he does have a job, but he hates it. And he's a gamer, he spends way too much time online, he watches too much porn, he doesn't have a girlfriend, he's probably fearful of even approaching women, but he really just wants something more out of his life. He doesn't know how to start getting toward that something more. Self-help toxic masculinists, they capitalize on this type of guy, capitalize on the negative emotional landscape that these men are experiencing and on the loneliness and the despair that they feel. And they tell these young men that the reason they feel as bad as they do is because of a crisis of masculinity created by radical, man-hating feminists and the broader woke left mob. I think in reality, however, the real crisis that they're exploiting is actually made up of several parts. First, and most significantly, I do believe it's wrought by neoliberalism's hegemony, by all of those negative socio-psychological effects that I outlined above. The internalized shame, the low self-worth, the loneliness, the lack of direction or meaning or purpose in life. These are things that we're all afflicted by, right? We're all living in the emotional and cultural wreckage of neoliberalism. It's not exclusive to men, but they do show up differently for different groups of people based on identity, based on socialization, based on personal lived experience. And second, I think another part of what's going on is what I think of as sort of like growing pains. I think it's a natural, quote unquote, natural part of social progress and of shifting norms and understanding surrounding gender. I think the reality is that change can be confusing for some people. It can be confusing to have a certain identity, one that you've constantly been fed your whole life through media, through cultural narratives, through people close to you. It can be confusing to have that thrown into question. And then, of course, not to mention the incredible backlash and fear-mongering from right-wing strategists and figures, which, of course, then aggravates these feelings of confusion and works to translate them into rage while politicizing them in the process. And then third, I think it's a crisis that's also been created, ironically enough, by toxic masculinity itself, which tells men who are facing all of these negative effects of neoliberalism, on top of any confusion that they may be sensing because of their shifting sense of collective identity, off of that right-wing fear-mongering and status threat that they just need to man up and swallow their feelings and put on a tough stoic exterior. So what self-help toxic masculinists like a Tate or Rogan or Peterson do is they take these very negative very real feelings. And instead of talking about those real crises, they attribute them to the crisis of masculinity, the Marxist, anti-biology, cultural elites, man-hating left or whatever. And they say the solutions to man up, reinforce traditional gender roles, patriarchy, tell men to be dominant and aggressive, tell them they need to be providers, tell them to be relentless, in the words of Jordan Peterson, to be monsters. But they go further than that. Self-help toxic masculinists, they can't rely on grievance alone. To simply call them grifter misogynists who know how to incite sexism in service of their regressive vision for society is true, but it's not the whole story. Stopping the analysis there, I believe, misses something really fundamental about the appeal of men like Tate or Peterson. I think what makes the gospel of self-help toxic masculinists so appealing, the reason that they have such massive followings, is because of what they preach, because what they preach is actually helpful to the men that they target. Their self-help advice actually works, at least in the short term, at least enough to get some of these young men out of depressed funks. Of course, their advice ends up hurting society, and I think arguably the individual men who buy into it in the long run are hurt as well. But it doesn't change the fact that in the here and the now, their message is powerful and resonant. Their message helps men psychologically, even if it hurts the rest of us. Like, if you just go on YouTube and you look at some of these guys' videos and you just scroll through the comments, it is really remarkable how many people are like, this guy changed my life. Like, I couldn't get out of bed for years, and this guy completely changed everything for me. Like, we can't dismiss the power of something like that. I think that these guys are giving young men a clear sense of purpose. They're telling them what their meaning in life is. They're giving them a clear sense of direction. They're giving them tools, tips, and strategies for improving their lives. And they're giving them a sense of empowerment, a feeling that they can actually exercise some degree of control over their lives. They're giving them a clear social script to follow, a clear story of how the world works, complete with heroes and villains. These are things that I think we all yearn for, especially as we live in the cultural wreckage of neoliberalism. And of course, what's wrong with self-help toxic masculinist approach is not that they tell men how to act or what to believe, but it's the content of the advice that they're giving. It's the vision that they're seeking to fulfill of the purpose and meaning and direction they say that men should pursue in life. This is just one example of how the far right relates to people based on identity and emotion, and how the far right weaponizes the emotional landscape created by neoliberalism as a way to manufacture buy-in for its vision and for how public and private life should look. And in an era of rapidly rising authoritarianism, or fascism, if you want to call it, as we descend further into whatever this hell is, I believe that it is a critical strategic mistake for the left to cede ground on these important existential human questions. And there's no reason that we on the left cannot offer similar ways of emotionally relating to people, offering them real in the now solutions that address their discontent. And most importantly, perhaps, offering them a vision of the good life that is not exclusionary and repulsive. How we do that, we can maybe save for another time, or maybe some discussion later today. But I will just say for now that, at least to me, one thing is clear. Policy alone is not going to get us there. Facts and data and statistics are not going to get us there. Appealing to logic or vague philosophical principles will not get us there. By relying too much on these things, I think progressives have really narrowed the terrain of engagement. They focused on elite policy discourse at the expense of engagement in mass culture, and at the expense of relating to people in ways that actually resonate with them through emotion, identity, and meaning. So I'm just going to end with a quote from the late British cultural theorist and sociologist Stuart Hall, who was really instrumental in shaping a lot of our views in writing this paper, who in 2007 said, "I think culture is very important, more than important. It's absolutely constitutive. Of course, culture isn't everything, but culture is a dimension of everything. Every practice exists in the material world and simultaneously signifies, is the bearer of meaning and value. Everything both exists and is imagined. And if you want to play in the area where deep feelings are involved, which people hardly understand, you have to look at culture. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, our last speaker for the first session is Fabian Muniesa, who comes by way of Paris from the PSL. The title of his talk is Finance, Paranoia, and the Radicalization of Value.
Thanks a lot. I'd like to first thank Stefanos and Samantha for the kind invitation and for putting together this inspiring conversation. And thank you also to Daniel, Carlo, and Shahrzad for their thoughts. I share their concerns. Their concerns for political imagination of populist rage, and also for the promise of the restoration of identity, truth, and value, or greatness in conservative and reactionary cultural strategy. Examples abound today everywhere in the world of how hopes of justice and resilience in the face of catastrophe and hardship morph into illiberal fury, often most worryingly in the guise of some sort of a paranoid anxiety. That far-right political tendencies maintain complex and manifold relations with conspiratorial thinking is a well-known fact. And this certainly calls for assessment in terms of delusion, distortion, alteration, manipulation. At the same time, though, as scholars of conspiratorial thinking have abundantly established, this assessment demands precaution. Demands so, in a sense, because alteration is everywhere. The kernel of conspiratorial thinking often stems from a somewhat fair interpretation of the political concepts of the tradition of liberal philosophy. Fair in the sense of faithful and attentive, though excessively radical, excessively literal, fundamentalist, obsessional, punctilious to the extreme. But the problem is that these concepts of the tradition of liberal philosophy are already loaded with phantasm. This is particularly the case in the tradition of liberal philosophy in the United States of America. And I am thinking, for example, of the work of scholars such as Michael Barkun or Timothy Mealy. In his book, Empire of Conspiracy, The Culture of Paranoia in Post-War America, Timothy Mealy examines the extent to which the agency panic that characterizes conspiratorial thinking, but also populist imagination, one may add, derives, at least in part, from the fragility inherent in the prime concept of liberal philosophy, namely the concept of liberty. Conspiratorial thinking operates as paranoia does, at least in part. That is, as a too serious, too intense drive towards the interpretation of the paradoxes of the polity, or as an extremist overinterpretation of something that works, in fact, a bit like an empty signifier or a fetish. Varieties of nationalist populism, religious radicalism, or secessionist libertarianism abound today that correspond to that syndrome in the United States as much as elsewhere. That is, an exacerbation of the tensions that are intrinsic to the dream of a radical liberal democracy, one constituted to free contracts between sovereign flesh and blood individuals that form the ultimate hub of resistance, one sometimes called the nation or the people, against the contrived powers of government. And this resistance becomes sacred as it embodies the very essence of the liberation of the soul, or in other words, the release of one's true value. Rousseau's metaphors made flesh. One can think immediately of the so-called sovereign citizen movement and of the enormous political traction it provides the present moment with. The sovereign citizen movement is not really a movement, certainly not a delineated, homogeneous movement, rather a sketchy cluster of tendencies, some clearly connected to the QAnon syndrome or to varieties of the MAGA syndrome, to that matter, in the US, but some other tendencies thriving in different guises elsewhere in the world. In Europe, certainly so. The United Kingdom and Ireland, but also Germany, Austria, France, Spain, and Italy have been offering fertile ground for particular strains of the sovereign citizen movement and of QAnon since at least a decade. Sure, there is an element of fringe in these phenomena, but there is also something momentous, an expression of the potentials on which is built the shape of fascism today. I would like to contribute to this discussion today with one suggestion, a suggestion that I hope talks to the problem of political emotions on the far right in a slightly renewed way. This is about considering value, the idea of value, as some sort of a political emotion. This is part of the argument that I try to develop in this book titled Paranoid Finance, which is now out in Europe and should be on sale here in the US in a few weeks. True value often appears in our conversations in the form of a concept of political economy. That is, as an analytical compass that allows us, or that at least is meant to do so, to assess the probity and intentionality of an economic process. Economic value theory, for example, of the standard or of the critical kind. Where does value come from, really, and how well or not a particular society is configured accordingly? This is roughly put how the idea of value pops up in our political economic conversation, be it positive or normative. My idea here is different. It is to consider value as a vernacular concept, as a notion inherent in the moral and political imagination of our time. This is a take that is being currently developed in the anthropology of finance, for instance, by Horacio Ortiz in his book, The Everyday Practice of Valuation and Investment, Political Imaginaries of Shareholder Value. Also in the historical sociology of economic valuation, for example, by Iliana Doganova in her book, Discounting the Future, The Ascendancy of a Political Technology. Value, then, understood not as an analytical category, but as the lingo of financial imagination, as the semiotic instrument of our time, an instrument with enormous performative powers. And the point is certainly not to take this lingo at face value. The point is to examine the tensions and paradoxes that it contains, the desires it foreshadows, and the anxieties it expresses. Value produces demons. More precisely, the metaphor of value creation that fits all kinds of hopes and fears. The notion of value produces meaning, but that meaning is inherently twisted. This is something that Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari already anticipated in their Capitalism and Schizophrenia. But this intuition acquires full relevance, I think, in the present moment. Value is a fetish, indeed, but in the psychoanalytical sense of the word, rather than in the sense popularized in critical political economy. That is, the fetish as a process of disavowal, the fetish as an image that we rely on in order to postpone the impact of reality, a reality in which the desired object, the fetish ought to stand for, is in fact manifestly missing. It is the very notion of value that stands as a fetish to which one has to cling in order to cope with the hopes and aspirations that foreshadow a society beyond capitalism. Only this fetish is the decoy, say, capitalism rules by. In other words, it is the very idea that capitalism may be concealing value that precipitates the fetishistic disavowal. The idea of value creation is in fact so perverse, so twisted, it is such a twisted, empty signifier that it stands at once for both the core of financial imagination, value creation means return on investment, and the core of the dominant critique of financial capitalism, for which veritable true value creation should be protected from the perils of malevolent speculation. My claim here is that the fixation with value fits both financial imagination and the dominant critique of finance, and that the effect of this is that is what we see in the drift of populist sentiment today, a form of political anxiety that sees in the restoration of value, whatever that means, the aim of spiritual and political uprising. The worldviews that feed the sovereign citizen movement, the QAnon syndrome, but also other strains of conspiratorial, millennialist, libertarian, secessionist, spiritual discourse about radical sovereignty are not only about radical freedom, they also abide by the rule of the notion of value, the hope of value creation and the fear of value destruction. The QAnon imagination, for example, financial value is central. It is evil and good at once. It has been amply established by QAnon investigators such as Mike Rothschild in his book, The Storm is Upon Us, by Aaron John Goliath in his book, Conspiracy and Triumph. Finance is evil and good at once. Finance is evil. It represents the threat from which true value ought to be protected. QAnon narratives involve the existence of a quote-unquote cabal defined as a conspiracy of globalist bankers who have enslaved our souls and sequestered our value, and the existence of a virtuous quote-unquote alliance led by Donald Trump, which is winning today a secret war against this evil force. The revolutionary solution to this is, in turn, essentially financial too, though. It involves a series of secret reforms known to the initiated through the acronym Nesara-Gesara or Nesara-Gesara. These shall achieve the restoration of the true value of persons and things by means, for example, of the institution of a magical currency based on the gold standard, also with some kind of cryptocurrency fantasy called the quantum financial system, which also connects the spiritual syncretism of quantum mysticism. In other variations of paranoid finance, closer to the sovereign citizen movement, this magic currency is just oneself, one's living body, an eternal soul, uno vale uno, considered as a CVAC, a creator's value asset center, from which infinite returns can be collected. This is the case of the syndrome known in conspiratorial milieus as OPPT, one's people public trust, which is my favorite one. I spend some time with it in my book. These cases exemplified the breadth of the phenomenon of value panic, which, akin to the agency panic examined by Timothy Melly in Empire of Conspiracy, feeds the political imagination of the present moment. And value panic offers, as a revolutionary antidote to the troubles of capitalism, the fetish that capitalism itself produces so well, the entitlement to value. This is my humble hypothesis, a hypothesis worthy of consideration, however, if one is to judge from the considerable amounts of passion, violence, pain, and disarray that the love of value can produce. The critique of finance is something that can morph into truly perplexing forms of conspiratorial thinking and spiritual cult. Sometimes these manifestly emerge as a result of a radicalized fetishization of some time of true value that should be protected from the perils of false value. Varieties of nationalist populism, religious radicalism, or secessionist libertarianism exemplify well these developments today all over the world. The promise of the restoration of the primordial organ of value production, whatever that means, by way of some sort of a mystical appraising or magical technique, operates as a distorted double of the very promise of finance itself, which is about veritable value creation. The rage these movements represent translates into a paranoid critique of finance and of political economy altogether, a critique that intensifies the fetishization of value in political economy comes. This is certainly not a new perspective. It communicates with a growing body of research that deals with the latent content encapsulated in dominant metaphors of value creation, and value destruction. In a way, for example, the polemical analysis famously offered by Moishe Postone in his assessment of the element of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany can be read as a contribution to this possible line of inquiry. The anti-Semitic kernel at work in nationalist uprising and fascist revolution operates indeed as a fundamentalist critique of capitalism and of finance more specifically. It contains some sort of an inbuilt political economy, an immanent theory of value that lay bare its spiraling potentials. A fetishization of real value, then, against the menace of abstract or fictitious value. This avowal of the hollowness of value, a discourse that buys into the prime decoy of capitalism and ends up turning its critique into its defense. What shall be done then? I don't know yet. Thank you.
Excellent. Three great thoughts. Looks like we have a lot of time for questions. Carlo has to leave a little bit early. I don't know if you want to direct, if you have questions you want to ask him, we could maybe direct those earlier and later. Any questions in the audience, or is this how we should proceed? Yes.
Oh, me first? Hi. My name is Teochino. I'm a social democrat. I'm the leader of the socialist faction in the Democratic Party. And I have three questions. I heard you, Carlo, started talking about Biden and referring to him as a social democrat. And at one point, for me, we'll get to that. And so the question I have for everybody is their definition of the left and the right, because the left and the right is a divide. And in Europe, the left and the right is a different divide than the left and the right in America. So when you presented your paper, when you present Biden being a social democrat, you move the left, including Biden is a liberal from a European standpoint. So you're moving the line to include liberalism. Shahrzad, when you talk about your presentation, you said the left, because we know where the ultra-right is, but where is the left? And you include, I feel like you are including the anti-capitalist left, but not the social democratic left in that masculinity talk. So I would like to know where each of you define your line of where the left and the right is the divide, so we can better understand your paper. Because if I use my American left and divide, I'm confused. If I'm using my European, I'm confused also. So that's my question. And same for Fabian, because you were talking about the 9/11, about conspiracy QAnon, but in France, when 9/11 happened, France already had in 2001 this conspiracy talk about the bombing of, so that was way before the technological appearance of QAnon, that 9/11. And you can see that in the north of France, back in the 70s, when the Communist Party was pushing conspiracy theory coming out of Soviet Union or whatever. So this is not a new phenomenon. So that's more of my question. Loaded, I thought.
I did not quite say that Biden is a social democrat. I just said that Biden did what social democrats thought had to be done to address the rise of populism. But I know that people on the left, on both sides of the ocean, are very invested in distinguishing the left from liberalism, the left from the center. Amongst the various problems or mistakes that I think we have been doing, trying to demarcate within the left who's a little bit more on the left, who's the true left, I think is a losing game. I think there's a history of what left and right means, and I'm the troubled one. I refer to where they come from, and I think the left is those who stand for freedom, equality, and fraternity, and the right are those who stand for authority, tradition, and religion. That's the French Revolution, and that's how I would define it. I think it gets more complicated in the 19th century with the emergence of the labor issue, but I mean, I think of myself on the left, and in the sense that I believe in equality and freedom and fraternity.
Okay.
Very well put. When I was talking about the left, I'm including slightly left of center, all the way left, because I think a lot of these things, they play out differently depending on where on the political spectrum on the left. I think this goes to what I was talking about, goes to liberals and progressives, but even like more radical leftists, I think you see a lot of the same kind of mindset of rationality showing up in social movements too, like this transactional kind of mindset. And I don't think it's ever explicit really, but it's like, people will join our mass movements if we can just, get them greater income, we can get them greater rights. And they'll be compelled to stay in our movements for the long run because, if they fight for 15 and they get it, then we're good. And I just don't think that's how that works. I don't think that the material gains translate that way for most people. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for these very simple questions. Perhaps two things. Yes, the right has no monopoly whatsoever on conspiratorial thinking. This is also high on the left and has been for decades. I think that that's the precaution that conspiracy talk requires. That an old attribute of the polity, conspiracy. So yes, it's not a marker for the far right. Perhaps another idea. I won't respond to your question. That's impossible. But it made me think about something I read recently, and an impact on me. It's a political philosopher called Alegre, who wrote this book in Spanish called El lugar de los poetas. And in one of the chapters, he underlines the idea that fascism contains also a theory of democracy, a theory of equality. Fascism should be also seen as a ranged or as a sessional way to restore the problems of democracy, the problems of the varieties of political positions in the polity. And the theory of democracy that is embedded in fascism is, in order to solve the contradictions of democracy, we need to build a democracy in where there is only one people. One people that has the same identity, the same values, the same worth, and exclude or destroy the other ones. And I see that this idea of national socialism is also something that is very close to things that are appearing now on the left, populist left, where the orientations to fascism is presented as a form in order to restore, to repair democracy by removing the bits that doesn't fit. I think this is something that is extremely important in order to understand the present moment of fascism.
So first, thank you. I think that all of this is just incredibly fascinating. The thing that I wanted to press on a little bit, I'd love to hear your responses about, is a division, a kind of continued division between kind of rationalism, economic thinking, technocracy, and culture. So there seems, even though there's an attempt to kind of complicate that division, it keeps coming back, because it is such a foundational part of our own kind of the structure of our thinking. So like, for instance, like these toxic masculine men who are responsive to Jordan Peterson et al., they have, they are responding to a certain kind of culture that is a product of the failures of neoliberalism. But I'm kind of wondering what might happen if we shifted the lens a little bit to think about rationalism or technocracy or economic thinking as its own kind of culture, its own set of commitments, its own, which has its own visions of collectivity, that and reason and moral thinking that undergird it. So instead of opposing it or putting culture into a basket kind of on the other side, what if we took culture and put it like at the center of our policy schools or our economics departments? Like what would happen to some of your arguments if you reverse that thinking?
I think we'd win more. I would hope we win more. I think like at the very beginning when Biden dropped out and took over, like we saw a little bit of that. At least like I felt a little bit energized, foolishly. But then they just like completely abandoned any sense of vision. And that's why I keep going back to this idea that I think like vision needs to be really foundational. And it feels like to the extent that there is a vision, it's like the same old BS that it's always been by the Democratic Party, at least in the last 30, 40 years. But your point is well taken. I think it is a culture. It's not to say that it's not a culture, but it's not one that most people seem to really resonate with. And it's certainly not a mass culture, I think you could say. It feels very like elitist, and that just, it's not going to work with apolitical bloggers that don't care about policy.
If I can just add to that, because I think it's an interesting thought. It sounds like, I don't know you, but we agree on.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But so there was that early moment in the campaign where the campaign was based on joy and freedom. That kind of dropped out about 4 weeks ago and became about fascism. So that asks, for me, asks a question, if you want to follow that thought of like, so we're talking about the political emotions of the far right, but what are the emotions of the left? What would Spinoza says, if you want to fight one emotion, you can only do it with another emotion, because reason is not going to defeat the emotions, so, or the affects, whatever. So what would be the emotion that the left advances against if rage is the one of the right, or whatever, fear? What is the emotion that we oppose to that is a question I pose to you, because we're so fucked that we need to think.
Taylor Swift.
Yeah, right.
It's like, that's a generational, very popular.
But what is the emotion of
I
Taylor
don't know, you
Swift?
have to ask Gen Z. I don't know. I don't listen to her.
Yeah, I'd like to add a few remarks on your very interesting question. Yes, economics and economic rationality is a culture, and a very weird one. And you cited Stuart Hall. I mean, this whole phenomenon needs this kind of cultural economic kind of approach. To me, all the concepts of economics, starting with growth, value creation, capital, future, return, are obviously cultural and striking ones. And I recommend today the work of historians of medieval economics, such as Giacomo Todeschino in Italy, that actually deconstruct cultural, theological origins of these concepts that are today posed as a rational policy option.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Hi, Daniel Judd. I'm going to stand just so you can see me. But I guess I wanted to pick up a bit on what Caitlin was asking, and I think that we'll probably circle back to this a lot throughout the day, this being a conference on emotions that is going to lead us into a kind of culture and maybe a more material analysis divide. And so I don't want to press on that divide either, but rather to say that I guess I felt uneasy listening to the panel because it feels like there's one narrative that comes out of this on the social democratic left that is already starting to coalesce, which is we did the economics. The economics didn't work clearly for what we wanted, right? Which is that we would build a kind of New Deal coalition, right? We did an industrial project. It didn't click in the way that it did with FDR. Something didn't work there. And so it must be emotion. It must be culture. It must be something that is disconnected from the material reality of people's lives because it wasn't that bad, right? And I mean, you know, this is all anecdotal experience, but speaking as someone who's done a bunch of labor organizing in Arizona before I came back to grad school and some canvassing this cycle, that strikes me as a really, really dangerous narrative that is not true to most people's experiences. And the anecdotal example would just be rent, right? Rent and housing costs also for homeowners and prospective home buyers, which has doubled in Phoenix over the past 7 years, right? That's a kind of economic shift that people feel very deeply and that obviously is then tied up in a lot of cultural assumptions, right? Around the American dream, about what it means to own a home, to possess a place of living, and so forth. And so I guess my question is to everyone on the panel, is would there be a way to do a more materialist analysis of the cultural turns that you're identifying, or of the emotional turns that you're identifying? And to specify that a little bit, what makes those turns particular to a moment certainly in the US, where, as you know, Steph referred to in his introduction, the breakdown of a kind of economic reality that anchored a particular conception of gender, right? That entrenched a particular conception of home life has largely broken down over the last 50 years. And you know, I take that that's some of what you're referring to with neoliberalism, but it was interesting to me that we quickly moved into neoliberalism as kind of an affective thing, right? Instead of a real political economic development and a shift in the structure or the regime of capital that we've experienced over the past 50 years. So what, you know, is there a way to, Fabian, I thought you were bringing that in a little bit, right? When we're talking about finance, and your reference to Pistone would be apt there as one way to kind of bridge the gap between a material and a cultural analysis. Are there others? Are there ways that you guys find particularly compelling? Or do you think really it's culture all the way down?
Thanks for pointing to this important discussion. But I guess it depends on how you define culture. If you say culture is disconnected from the material culture, or pun intended, the material reality, that's one different definition of culture. To me, culture are the material conditions of existence. That's something which is very important to declare. Anthropologists talk about material culture. To me, the concepts of economics would be also cultural in the sense that they are ideological in a sense. But culture is about the material existence of ourselves. We're talking about psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is about the material conditions of bodies, of desire, of relations between people. So this is not about just mental whims, or affects in a sense of, you know, representations. It's about the very material conditions. So material is the word. And then you can either shift toward economics or towards anthropology. But I agree with you on the fact that this is about materiality from all the way down.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, the emphasis on culture is more like you have all of these material realities, these material hardships, but how they show up for people tends to be through affect, I think. At least like the day-to-day lived experience of it is going to be channeled through emotion. But I also want to say, like, I work at a policy think tank. So when I write this paper, it's for a very specific elite progressive policymaker audience who I think has only read about tax policy for the last like 15 years. So I want to be clear, like I totally hear you and I agree with you. I think that it's a false dichotomy to say there's just culture and there's just policy. But I think maybe in this case, it might be more of like an audience thing.
Yeah, I'm trying to say, but I don't think anybody here is saying it's cultural the way down, whatever that would mean. The way I think about it, and the metaphor I was using is Plato's three parts of the soul. There's eros, is the desire for material objects. It exists, but there's also something else, which is the desire for recognition. It seems to me that the pendulum, if you will, has not been that we haven't had enough material analysis. We've had, in fact, too much. We've forgotten the other dimension. So without denying the importance of the economic and of the rent is too damn high, we also have to think of other dimensions too. That would be the gesture, the intervention. It's not as if it's been work. You say our strategy is dangerous. It's not as if the other one has been doing that well. So my point is, this is the dimension that needs to be cultivated and thought about more without ignoring the importance of the material dimension.
Both and.
Yeah, I want to push you a little farther on exactly how one might address this cultural dimension, because you all have a shared critique of the failure of the left, capaciously defined, from centrist Democrats on, to not address that and focus too much on policy and the economy. And it clearly is not resonating. A whole lot of people feel their lives are worse, even though you can show them all the statistics. But all of you were rather thin on exactly how you might make this appeal. Take toxic masculinity. I mean, it's so powerful for young men who feel women have won out, gays have advantage, immigrants are a part of their problem. It appeals to a sense not merely of rage, but of victimization. And that's a very powerful position all over on the right. Christians feel victimized, young men feel victimized. What substantively, what emotion should we appeal to? How might one give them the kind of recognition that they feel they clearly are not getting?
I don't know how to answer that. Please take it away.
By the way, look, what I was talking about was rage, and it was a diagnosis. If I had the answer, I probably should be canvassing instead of speaking here. But no, let's develop the thought that you encourage us to go in. What is the emotion of the left? What is, if we buy that Spinozan idea that emotions can only be fought by emotions, how do you counteract rage or fear? Look, let's think a little bit about it. Obama was hope, right? That was the emotion, and we both discovered the power of that and also the hollowness that can come with basing your politics around the politics of hope. And Harris was joy for a little while. What do we think of a politics of joy? It's also Spinozan in resonance. What would it mean to try to think of this war, the war with the left, not in terms of, wonky politics, but in terms of what is the emotional register? You were canvassing, I ask you, like what emotions do you want to spark in people if you want to persuade them to not vote Trump? I don't know, like are there, and I put two on the table, hope and joy as potential emotions of the left, but if you have better ideas, I did not write a book about that, but I'd be happy to. So I open it up I give the question back to you if
Well, I also want to challenge that the right is also only anger and rage. Like if you go to a Trump rally, it's like a Grateful Dead show. Like there's tailgates for hours outside. It's like a big party. Like that's joyful for those people. Like we're terrified of it, but that's a real thing that they're experiencing. So, I mean, that complicates it even more, but, and on the flip side, rage can be channeled for good too, right? Like we are right to be pissed about the circumstances we're in, and how do we then channel that for good instead of reactionary
Yes, I think that's a
politics.
very good, they're not emotions of the left and emotions of the right, but it has to be the right.
Yeah, thanks for this complicated question. I think that we know about the failure of cultural concepts that are dangerous for the left, and I bet on the dangers of the concept of value. I think it doesn't play well. But there have been multiple alternative cultural concepts for the left that were fantastically potential, and I think that one is the concept of the commons, concept of communism that was in part stemming from a critique of value, a critique of the dissolution of this bourgeois notion of value. And I think it has immense political potential. It requires a lot of courage because it requires the dismantling very well entrenched institutions of our daily lives, for example, rent, for example, private property, and so on. The idea of the unity, not the social community, but the commonality, the commons, the communist good is one among others. I think it works.
About 15 hands raised, just to let you know. So I'm trying my best to keep more here. So yes.
Hi, thank you. It was really super interesting. I enjoyed all the papers so much. I had a question. I guess it's not about an emotion, but maybe a concept that seems to sit alongside a lot of this, which is like liberty and freedom. And I just enjoy hearing more from each of you about if you've encountered that and where. I mean, you're talking about rage as a form of liberty, or not being enslaved, the kind of freedom to feel rage, or that rage allows is the thing that like demarcates you as free. And also, thinking about kind of agency and control over your life, and the freedom of the free market, and where freedom has been tied often so much to kind of visions of the right. And if there's kind of an emotional register of freedom at all that you feel sits somewhere in amongst what you're doing, each of you.
Well, freedom is the key concept of the sovereign citizen movement, of the militia movement, of the freemen on the land, of the Montana freemen on the land, of the comitatus, of all these sheriff movements in the US, in Canada, Romana Didulo, the Queen of Canada, all the conspiratorial offsprings of QAnon in Europe. OPPT is big in Italy, for example. So this is the problem. And this is something that you also notice if you open a page at random in the social contract. It's a concept which is explosive. It doesn't work very well. It's complicated. So if you take it literally, it's a fragile concept. And in a sense, democracy is the care for the fragility of the concept of freedom. That's the problem. I think it has to be handled with care. It can become toxic. Today, that's also the despair, is to see that most of these movements that we call far-right fascism are enamored with the concept of freedom, and concept that we recognize as ours. So handled with care. As Spinoza would say, like poison. Poison, it's just a matter of doses also. Poison is good, but you have to be careful.
I guess I'm temperamentally a little different. I think we reclaim it from them, and we say that theirs is not freedom but authority. But about your question, I think it's interesting. How does freedom relate to the emotions, and whether rage can be associated with it? I think rage is the beginning of politicization. That's what Aristotle was saying, is like you need to be able to feel it in order to react against oppression and injustice. But here, a distinction that might be useful is Arendt's distinction between liberation and freedom. I think rage is good for liberation. It's not very good to actually constitute freedom. There, we need to move to a different emotional register, it seems to me. Rage is good in that liberatory moment, and in that sense, it can be an emotion of the left. But then you needed to shift to a different register if you want to constitute freedom or something like that.
Before we got a lot.
Dirk.
Right, now these are terrific panels. I was wondering if when we're talking about culture, and we were now talking a bit more granularly about the US, whether we need to talk about culture and counterculture. you mentioned these Trump rallies and so forth. I actually watched as much as I could. Like, you need to watch the whole thing on, YouTube, not just the clips that are pulled out of the liberal media where he says, really stupid, outrageous things. And you can see this is styling itself like the churches in this country is counterculture against the mainstream, which are all these celebrities that supported Kamala Harris, the Taylor Swifts, the J-Los, and others, right? And they styled themselves. I also did a master's degree at Notre Dame a long time ago where, although I'm not Roman Catholic, I'm not Roman Catholic, I observed, Catholic conservatives feeling beleaguered at the time when Clinton won, this is in the 90s, and feeling very alienated from coastal elites, the mainstream Hollywood, that whole discourse. And they weren't even evangelicals, but it was the same discourse. And that pivots then to press you, Carlo. Carlo and I actually colleagues at City College. I could ask you this up there, but we'll do it here. You were running almost an Arendtian atomization thesis. People are atomized, they're no longer embedded in civil organizations and therefore open to mobilization, manipulation by demagogues and so forth. But in fact, if you look at the core constituency of MAGA, they are embedded in institutions like churches, and they're running a countercultural argument. And they're saying, well, we finally have managed to win this round in this culture war. We haven't talked about culture wars. There is a culture of the quote unquote left, or liberals, if you like. We need to disentangle that. And there is the opposite culture. And at some point, one prevails over the others. Universities are in trouble now and have been for some time because they seem to be occupied enemy territory by Peter Thiel. And what was that infamous speech by Vance? The professors are the enemy. I mean, it's a cultural war, and we'll have to see how it plays out. Now, so what is the animating emotion in the culture of the quote unquote left, which isn't really left? I mean, it is established, as some of you said, it's not even social democratic, right? So I wanted to sort of just put those things on the table to sort of start differentiating, segregating some of these big talk of culture.
Okay, thank you. I think that's an interesting challenge to my argument that anger does not stem from this atomization, alienation. They are structured. This is an organized society. They are in the churches. And I guess that would have to be a different reading, and we'd have to actually, it's an empirical question. The way I would try to, while recognizing the force of this objection, I would try to say, are they really structured? Like, is the Trump voter somebody who's organic to a political struggle? Or is it more like an incel who goes to, if they go to church, it's a mega church that organizes not a form of collective action, but a form of decenter, highly hyper-individualized reaction. So and I think you're right that there are lines of conflict. So one problem of my thesis is I have to say there's no struggle. Look, they're organized. More people are voting. So that's, I'm sensitive to the power of your argument. But one distinction one would have to make would be, what is different between the type of social organization that existed, let's say, under fascism, when it was a mobilized society, a structured in trade unions, in a party, when society was mobilized and you had black shirts marching, and something like this today. A category that comes to mind is, I don't know if you know that a little bit wacky theorist Byung-Chul Han uses the distinction, category of the swarm. They're not organic to a struggle. What we have today are not classes, organized, mobilized classes, but swarms. And so the form of mobilization, he says, is the shitstorm online. That's a form of organized collective action that's quite different and not culturally hegemonic, organic in the way the old culture wars, the 19th century culture wars organized. I think to understand Trumpism, we have to understand this new sociology of the swarm and the shitstorm rather than the organized churches.
I have a quick follow-up to that. And it brings back to the material question that we got, the gentleman at the back. is the attack on DEI is central in this culture war, and there's a material basis because, and this is where race comes in and whiteness, which we've not spoken about much or if at all, is that DEI is seen as a threat to the social reproduction of white middle class and those that aspire to join it. And it's no accident that's at the center of the cultural war for the MAGA movement and those associated with it. And it's harder to reach make middle class. What do Americans say? The ticket to the middle class, right? So it's harder to buy that ticket if universities, which are the gatekeepers of this, or the vehicle or conduit for class mobility in this country, are making it harder for white people. I mean, that's, if you read Chris Rufo, that is wildly popular, and it's running Florida and every other Republican governed state in this country. I mean, it's very concrete in that way. We can really break these sort of big talk of culture into quite specific struggles.
Yes, I agree. And you mentioned, well, in this problem of the cultural wars, you mentioned the role of churches. I think that if we identify pockets of power struggles in the cultural wars, the anthropology of finance, as I say, because finance is it's not church, it's finance. Banks, the banking industry, that's an important manufacturer of weaponry for the cultural wars. And when I say finance, I don't mean sort of a fantasized idea of global speculation. I mean finance as it is, the idea that we live in a society where in order to thrive as a normal person, we need to think about everything in terms of assets, our life, our family, our
Credit
future.
rating.
Sorry?
Credit rating in this country.
Credit rating, for example, is something which is interesting because it's not about free markets. It's about monopoly. It's about the cancellation of competition. That's an ingredient of finance, which is very important. Finance is about ensuring the future. So, for example, a credit rating agency rates an asset very well because it observes that it doesn't have a competition, it doesn't have a risk. So, talking about risk is a vernacular of it. The notion of risk is a weapon in the cultural war. It's a weapon that has been not produced by churches, but by banks, by bankers, and by rating agencies and so on. So I feel that the contribution from a material culture, anthropology of the material culture of finance, to this analysis of the cultural war goes into that direction. Peter Thiel, Zuckerberg, Sam Altman, all these visionaries of Silicon Valley have a religious element, but it's also about finance, but the promise of value creation in the future. This is also a factory of weaponry for this. Yes, I agree with you, and we have to look around, and not only on the church side, also on Wall Street.
Student in the back to left of Stefanos.
My question was to the gentleman over there. If we use your concept of paranoid finance, how can it help us understand?
I'm going to speak up a little bit. Can't hear you up here.
If we use your concept of paranoid finance, how can it help us understand the appeal of conspiracy theories and alternative financial schemes in today's society? And also, a question to Shahrzad, what is your opinion on the concept of paranoid finance?
Thanks a lot. When I use the notion of paranoid finance, it includes regular finance. It's not that there is a rational finance, and then there is a fringe, strange, wacky kind of finance. It is that these fringe kind of expressions of finance exemplify the potentials, the paranoid potentials of the core of mainstream financial imagination. So it's very difficult to talk about an alternative. The alternative would be to step out of financial imagination entirely, to step out from the idea that we are investors, investing in our future, to drop entirely these ideas. How? Well, this is the key to anthropology. Anthropology is also the anthropology of money, modern finance. The anthropology of money is a way to understand different ways of understanding, of making sense of this glue of society that we call money. And perhaps that as I said, the idea of the commons, the idea of considering money beyond private property, beyond investment, could be an alternative. There are in the room, there are specialists of Georges Bataille in the notion of expenditure, of dépense. Those are intellectual horizons that have been examined by Georges Bataille, Pierre Klosowski, also by Guattari and Deleuze. And I think that there are potentials there in order to examine this kind of otherness finance, including in the political contestation of finance. But to criticize finance with the concepts that finance itself has provided us with, like value, it's not advisable.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the contradiction of all of the stuff that we're talking about right now. Like, I mean, in the neoliberal context that I'm talking about, it's so much of what ails us created by neoliberalism. We are still in the culture of neoliberalism, so we have to respond with the tools that neoliberalism gives us. And that makes for a hell of a paradox and contradiction to try to sort through in our day-to-day lives. And like in the paper, we talk about a group of people, we call them strivers, who are, I think we all have bits of different kind of cultural pieces to us, but these are folks who really try to make it within the current system through things like self-help and wellness and popular cultural concepts like that, which are shaped themselves by neoliberalism. And I think that's like, it's kind of exactly what you're saying.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to pick up on the issue of rationality again and this culture material reality. I still think that there is some contrast between like material reality and culture because, and of course, like you can't separate them totally, but it's only within this, and culture, I think, is very much intertwined with the concept of identity. So it's only as members of this like white identity there is that you have Elon Musk and white trash identifying as this white group that is under attack and all that. So and I was also thinking about like a piece written by Adorno that is very rarely read, Democratic Leadership and Mass Manipulation. And they're based on their studies in authoritarian personality, which were supposed to be about understanding like the cultural issues or psychological issues of the audience. They were trying to come up with ways to communicate with these people. And it's very interesting that there Adorno is talking about like what the far right does is psychological manipulation through the use of identity and identification and all that. And he was emphasizing that what we need to do, like with many, like it's preconditions and all that, but is exactly to emphasize the material interests of people, to show them how we are going to promote them. And he gives an example of, some surveys in which people were asked about the New Deal, how they thought about it. And many people on the right, they were like, you're totally against it. But when you ask them about individual items on the New Deal that provided or to their interest, they would agree with it. And, and it's interesting for me. And I also wanted to say that, the concept of rationality and culture, if we are to, presuppose such dichotomy, the concept of rationality is, of course, like way more complex than rational choice theory, which is a totally irrational concept, presupposes. You can think of rationality as a rationality that is not like very strictly distinct from emotions, but is based on convincing the audience rather than manipulating their psyche and riding on their emotions. And it's very interesting to me that we are having these discussions about culture and materiality after the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. Because Bernie Sanders, like he didn't drive much on emotions or identity, but he was very clearly talking about the materials interests of the people. And many people who were attracted to Bernie Sanders' campaign ended up voting for Trump. So we have that example that talking about the material interests of people has managed to gain attraction. But now, like thinking that we need to get rid of, or like we have too much emphasized rationality and economic interest, it's not working, let's move to culture. I mean, isn't culture what Democratic Party has been about all this time, like identities, different identities. We are, like incorporating all these different identities. And it's very anti-pluralistic. That's another topic, because only people are accepted whose identities are recognized. So you have to, your identity has to be recognized by these people, like as trans, as, however you are categorizing these identities, to then say that they are welcome. And I think like this is a very problematic issue. And like when we are talking about, like, again, like my concept of rationality is not contrasted to reason, but exactly at this point, one rational and also like, this is a weird word, but erotic in the sense of like being inspired by eros, is the idea that we as a human species, universally, all over the world, are being exposed to very existential threats, such as environmental crisis, such as the far right, which is happening all over the world. And instead of, again, insisting on these particularistic cultures or identities, can't we start talking about like a universal thing, try to transcend all these like culturalistic specifications and, like really advocate for human species in a very rational way, because the existing reality is totally irrational. And the rationality of rational choice theory and the current system is pushing us towards extinction. So why not like being more rational in that sense, rather than just, like using culture, which could lead to manipulation, which again, like the far right is always better at manipulating emotions. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I think because we're running out of time, I'm gonna take a bunch of questions and I'm gonna read some that came in from viewers via Zoom. So, and then maybe take one more in the audience. So if you just write some of this down. This is from Benjamin Biel, PhD candidate in history at the CUNY Grad Center. States, I want to ask a question concerning the role of media in emotional politics. I was especially interested in Shahrzad's example of toxic masculinity. Self-help media seems one of the main methods through which the right can activate the emotional or even ideological vacuum of neoliberalism is by capitalizing on new information technologies that create a sort of on-demand propaganda that invades private spaces and sort of submerges political subjects in a worldview that is almost impenetrable by competing ideologies. In what sense do your works handle propaganda or disinformation, or whatever term you would use to address the creation of different emotional affective spaces that compete with fact or economic rationality? In short, is there more to say about social media as opposed to traditional mass media as a unique and contingent factor in the centrality of political emotion since the 1990s? One more question here very quickly. This one is by Sakshi Sharda. Coming back to the link between anger and freedom. Anger is collectively felt and has been historically felt at both ends of any polarization. Suffrage movement, for instance, anti-slavery struggle. But there's a difference between just anger and unjust anger. There's a difference between just anger and unjust anger. There was also struggles that affected the honor status of the privileged. So I guess my question is that within the right today, there is a belief not just that there is a loss of their present, but a loss of a past that has never been part of, they've never been part of. So how do you give hope to a constructed past? And maybe up here in the front, there was one question. We'll take that as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I just want to take the opportunity to refine our historical imagination of like who we're even talking about when we talk about the far right. My Korean immigrant mother just voted for Trump for the third time now, 2016, 2020, and 2024, as did my sister. And my district in New York City, which is Bensonhurst and Staten Island, where I was born and raised, is the only red district in all of New York City, but New York City itself sort of shifted rightwards overall in terms of like the representatives that were voted for. We voted for a Chinese American representative, apparently, not myself personally, right, in our district, right? And that's no exception. So actually the fastest growing, if not the largest percentage of far right folks in the US are actually not like white MAGA masculinist, Elon Musk lovers, but actually are immigrants and children of immigrants from kind of like post-Cold War countries. And so I just want to introduce that demographic because I think that it seriously troubles a lot of our assumptions about why the far right exists and what's happening. So first of all, and it's too bad that he's not here anymore, but like this distinction between like the left or liberal and the right, as the left or liberals are about, égalité, fraternité, all this stuff is completely meaningless. Because you ask my sister and my mother, and they're also all for freedom. And if anything, they feel like it's the liberals who are against genuine freedom, equality, fraternity, et cetera, right? And then, I think, and so like that's just like one level, right? But I think that part of the issue of like actually conceptualizing what the right is that we've domesticated that and not actually taken a very hard look at the legacies of US empire abroad and its sort of boomerang effect, to borrow common critical theory terminology, into like why it then comes back home, right? So we can say like, yes, let's critique, let's critique finance capitalism through notions of the commune and communism. But you're asking people to do that who in recent historical memory were murdered by US backed armies abroad for having those exact politics. Like, that's what happened to my family, right? And so I just worry because part of what's happening, and I think this is like clear also in Shahrzad's presentation, is that there's a bit of projection happening where, if I may make vulgar use of that psychoanalytic term, right, where we're saying that it's the right that's using identity, but that's not exactly true, as the previous questioner just said, the previous in-person questioner, right? Actually, what's been happening is that over several decades, the sort of liberal centrist body of the Democratic Party has been appropriating certain measures from like leftist notions of equality, justice, et cetera, making them into identitarian claims. And a lot of what the right wing opposes are those identitarian claims. And I think like the evidence of that is the fact that despite the vast gulf between my politics and my family's politics, we have a lot to relate on because we both sort of resent this centrist liberalism. So I just want to return to the first question, which is that it's actually very, very important to distinguish between left, liberal, and right, because that's exactly what we're experiencing right now.
A lot there.
I think I gotta make you. Should I?
Go for it.
Thanks for this very pessimistic clarification of terminologies. I completely agree with you. I'd like to pick up on a few ideas that were suggested the first time. One first thing I would like to react with is perhaps the fact that we talk too much about the US. When we talk, for example, about the importance of the rational material interest of people, talk about the material interest of people that are living in a society in where there's private property, there's media, there are polls that can be manipulated by the media. There is credit, there is a banking system, people are homeowners, and that's the universe. Well, it's not. The very idea of Marshall Salins in his book, Economic Reason, Culture and Economic Reason, is to consider that economic reason can be completely different. I mean, imagine the very notion of the material interests of people in a situation where none of that exists. So no private property, other things exist. So that's I think it's important to disenclave these kind of discussions in order to make them more universal, to relativize these ideas of what it means to talk about the rational material interest of something. Then perhaps about the notion of rationality. The notion of rationality is also a very fragile one. I mean, mainstream psychiatrists would say that schizophrenia is a very rational disease. It's about the compulsion to decode, to interpret in a completely, in a completely literal manner. So the rationality of schizophrenia is an expression that makes sense in psychiatry, for example. And also the idea that the very notion of rationality, of factual rationality, carries also a shadow of problems, is the topic of illustrious writers such as Horkheimer and Adorno, the dialectics of Klärung, which basically suggests that we need to look at the consequences of this overemphasis on rationality. And perhaps one last point, your comment made me think about your comment on race. Made me think about the importance of race and racism in the anthropology of finance. For example, there is currently a very interesting work done on, we were talking about the notion of risk as a vernacular notion in the financial mind, right? So the idea that we, in international finance, when you look at an asset, for example, as an economy in a developing country, and you use this recurrent notion of country risk, of it's very difficult, it's very dangerous, it's risky to invest in Congo, for example, because the rates are high. If I'm a rating agency, I'm going to put a bad rating on African infrastructure. This is the result of a heavy colonial tradition, racist, that has been thematized and analyzed as such by anthropologists such as Paul Gilbert recently. I can't remember the name of the book recently, but there was a co-edited book that talks about that, about the coloniality of finance and the vital substrate of many concepts in finance, especially the notion of risk. So there is a direction in order to analyze these things.
Last.
I actually wanted to get clarification on your question, because to me, like the rise of the multiracial right, which is at this point increasingly well documented, isn't really, it kind of supports what I'm saying. So maybe I'm just not understanding your question or your critique.
No, I just think that there are a lot of vulgar notions about like what the right, who the right is opposing, that erase the role of the left and also opposing those things. So for example, with this sort of DEI that Dirk brought up, right? Like actually, it assumes that these sort of like liberal projects like diversity, equity, inclusion are this sort of beleaguered project that we should be protecting. But in fact, some of the original critics of DEI were scholars on the left, particularly Black feminists like Audre Lorde, who famously said, to be a Black feminist is to either get hired or get killed or something like that, right? And so part of what's happening is that, DEI itself was a sort of policy concession within the rapidly financializing university, right? That was a way to absorb the more radical demands of student movements around ethnic studies, the anti-war movement in the 70s, right? And so I just worry that this sort of, because you said that you agreed with this sort of more capacious notion of the liberal left, and doing that actually erases what's actually happening in that it's actually not the right versus everyone left of the right. It's actually like the left and the right have been critiquing the center for a very long time. And it would behoove us to take advantage of that as organizers on the left and as theorists from the left.
I see. Yeah. Okay. I don't have any response for you other than damn, good point. Thank you. I would love to talk more about this afterward though.